So a little bit of brief background on Tolkien, which is nothing that you couldn't find by reading his Wikipedia page, which is pretty good. He was born in 1892, so he was actually older than C.S. Lewis by a little bit, and he lived longer than C.S. Lewis. He only died in 1973 at 81. He was actually born in South Africa and not England, but he moved to England when he was fairly young. He did have memories of South Africa, which he will bring up every once in a while in his letters and in his writings. He said that may have influenced him a little bit. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and that is actually pretty evident in his writings. It is explicit in his letters, which are actually very good to read. He's a great letter writer. You can see that more prominently in things like, well, how many of you guys have read Lord of the Rings? Or any of the, okay, a few of them. How many of you guys have seen the movies of Lord of the Rings? Okay, almost everybody. Okay, that's good. Well, if the few of us that haven't seen it, I'm gonna maybe spoil some things because the movies did come out 14 years ago. So, isn't that awful? That was like 14 years ago. Yeah, it's like 2001, I think. They started filming in 1999. It's crazy. Okay, so like the lembas bread is a picture of the Eucharist because it's light and airy and it gives you strength beyond what it should contain. It's got this kind of metaphysical property. You can see these Mary figures. Tolkien was very fond of the Virgin Mary, so you can see people like Galadriel, who are these pure heavenly queens that you can see. Some of his influences, his primary influence came from two things, which was Norse mythology. He discovered Norse mythology when he was young and just kind of devoured it. And this was one of the interests that actually sparked his friendship with C.S. Lewis, because Lewis also really loved Norse mythology. And they had a club at Oxford called the Coal Biters Club, and they would read different things from the Eddas and Viking stories. So that was something that this kind of northern idea of holding out in the darkness against all hope and bravery and things like that, you can see really prevalent in Lord of the Rings. The other thing that really drove him in creating Middle-Earth was Anglo-Saxon poetry and mythology, like Beowulf and things like that. His primary motivation, well, he had a lot of primary motivations in making Lord of the Rings, and almost all of them were completely personal. It was actually Lewis that convinced him that he should make it public, because Lewis was one of the few people that he even shared his writings with. His secretary knew about it at the college, and some of his family that he would read it to, and that was about it. And Lewis just fell in love with it and said, you need to get this out to the people. And so his primary motivations were to create a mythology for England. Being a philologist and a historian of language, he realized that things like the King Arthur legends are not actually English; they're French, or at least the bulk of them that we know of. And Beowulf is almost the only prominent English mythology that we still have. Most of it was destroyed during various invasions from the outside. The Norman conquest kind of wiped out the old Anglo-Saxon culture. And he was looking to get that back and try to find a myth for England. He was also trying to find a place where his invented language of Elvish could be spoken. So he loved making up these languages, and he made up Elvish, which is based a lot on Finnish, and some various things of that nature, some other Scandinavian Norse influences. And he kind of said that, he felt like language has to have a history. It can't just be out somewhere. Language is always formed by the culture and the history of the events of the people that speak it. And so in order to have this language of Elvish, you've got to have the history of the elves for it to be real. And so that's what he wrote. And that's the Silmarillion, and that's the kind of the root from which everything else grew. Okay, what will we be talking about today? We are not going to be talking about the worldview of Tolkien himself, which was just Catholic theology, and we can find that elsewhere. You'll study that in the Sire book on Christian theism. What we're going to be talking about is the worldview of Tolkien's mythology of Middle-Earth. So, what is the way that the world that he created is set up? And this is one of the most important concepts in Tolkien studies, is the idea of subcreation. And subcreation is exactly what it sounds like. It is creation within creation, or beneath creation. Tolkien believed that we are created in the image of God, and as beings in the image of God, we create because God creates. He is the creator, and he's the ultimate storyteller. Did you guys watch that video that Phil sent you? Okay. Well, you hear him talk about subcreation, and God is the storyteller. And he says it's kind of our duty and our purpose as human beings to create worlds and to invent things. That ties a lot into the Crouch book that we've been reading as well. I think Crouch would agree with that. So this is what Tolkien was doing. He was making a world because he believed that that's how he fulfilled this image of God in himself. So you'll hear a lot about subcreation in Tolkien studies. And there are Tolkien studies. You guys don't laugh at me because I'm working on some of it right now. Okay, so we're going to go over, I think there's 7 questions that Sire talks about. I'm going to give you them all right now, and then we'll go through and talk about them in detail. The first question is, what is the nature of ultimate reality? The second question is, what is the nature of material reality? So what is the world and what is the universe? Next question is, what is a human being? Kind of the meaning of what it means to be human. What happens to a person at death? Do you just cease to be? Do you get reincarnated? What happens? Why is it possible to know anything at all? What is the basis for knowledge of the world? How do we know what is right and wrong? What is the basis for ethics? And finally, what is the meaning of human history? All right. So, got people that have read Lord of the Rings. So have anybody that has read the Silmarillion? Part of it. Did you read the first part? Okay. I'm really weird because I like the Silmarillion, and I'm also really weird because I like the books of Chronicles in the Bible. So most people that do that, they're kind of similar. It's these like vignettes, these stories of kings and the things that they do. Well, a lot of this is going to be taken from the Silmarillion because that is kind of Tolkien's cosmological framework. We start off with the nature of ultimate reality, which is Eru, or Iluvatar, and that is Tolkien's name for God. This is a monotheistic universe. There is one supreme creator God, and that is his name. The difference is that this God is kind of, he's not quite as involved directly as our God is. Tolkien says that this is the same world. Like he conceives of this as like this is the prehistory of our world. And so this is pre-gospel, this is pre-Old Testament, this is pre-everything. So we've got no kind of explicit knowledge of this deity except for kind of what the elves have told us, because they have hung out in the Undying Lands, which is heaven basically. So you've got the supreme god Eru, and underneath him you've got Valar and Maiar, and these are kind of angels and archangels. These are created beings, but they're extremely powerful, and they have spheres of influence. So Tolkien, being a classicist and a history buff and things like that, he really wanted to tap into the idea of gods with a small g. I think he found that appealing as a fictional element. So whereas you've got Apollo, the god of the sun, and you've got the goddess of love and things like that. Tolkien, being a Christian, obviously couldn't call them gods, and so he said that it was the angels that had charge of these different things, and he called the angels Valar and Maiar. And Gandalf is a Maiar, which is the lesser rank, the kind of the servants of the Valar. Saruman is as well, and so is Sauron. So you see kind of all of the big players in the Lord of the Rings are actually supernatural. Now, the Valar are the ones that really run things in the world, and they're the ones that kind of are shaping and guiding history. Eru is kind of up there watching them play around, and he's in control of everything, but he kind of lets them do their thing. So you can see this is an influence in Tolkien's Roman Catholicism, which has a much heavier influence on free will than a lot of Protestant thought does. Like Presbyterian and Reformed, you would find a bigger emphasis on God's providence. But Catholic theology is very based in the theology of Thomas Aquinas, and it's very free will oriented. And so you see this, that Tolkien even has the people that are running his universe kind of do their own thing, and Eru is kind of in control in the background. So the gods were once very active. By the time of the Lord of the Rings, they've gotten pretty distant. This has happened because they have not quite screwed up the planet, but they have... Okay, I'm going to have to go back a little bit. What happened is that the elves that live in Middle-Earth are actually exiles from the actual elven homeland, which is across the ocean. Like at the end of the movie, when Frodo and Gandalf and Elrond like all sail into the west, that's where they're going, is like to the Undying Lands, which is the true kind of purified, restored creation. And so the elves that are here are actually the ones that decided to leave this place and go and strike out on their own. As a result of that, the Valar kind of washed their hands of them and said, you know what, if you guys don't want to be obedient, if you guys want to go do your own thing, then we're going to let you. And that has gotten people into a lot of trouble. As you can see, Sauron has had his way with them. So the good gods and the good angels are kind of far off. You can see them in little acts of providence. There's some visions that happen in the books that are not present in the movies that kind of guide and direct Frodo. Frodo's kind of like a prophet. He has these supernatural visions. He's got these premonitions in the books that is not emphasized in the films. The interesting thing is that supernatural evil is actually still very present and very active. I mean, you've got Sauron, and you've got the Balrogs, and you've got the orcs are not supernatural, but they're obviously the direct servants of the big bad guy. And this is a very interesting kind of place in Tolkien because his conception of evil is bipolar. On one side, you've got the Catholic notion of evil, which is that evil doesn't actually exist. It is just the lack of goodness. As a shadow is the absence of light, as cold is the absence of heat, evil is the absence of good. The only thing that really exists, or the only thing that has true existence, is goodness. Which means that the more evil you are, the less you actually exist. And then you have things like ring wraiths, which are just these shadow figures. That's what I'm writing my paper on right now. Evil also has a tendency to devour itself. So you can see like Shelob. He talks about the great spider, that she just gets so hungry. She's bottomless. She's got no existence in herself. She has to feed off of other things. And in the end, he says, she probably just crawled into a hole and devoured herself, the very uttermost end of hunger. She's got nothing else to do. So on one side, you've got this classic Augustinian notion. On the other side, you've got what Tom Shippey calls the Manichaean notion, which is that evil is a positive thing that is set up against good. It has existence in itself. And this is something that Tolkien plays around with because he was in the trenches in World War I. A lot of his friends died there. He saw all of the gassing and the mud and the blood and the barbed wire and whole villages being wiped out. He was at the Battle of the Somme in France, in which Britain alone lost more people on the first day of the Battle of the Somme than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. So let that sink in. If you've ever been over to Europe, World War I has a much bigger place in like the cultural memory of Europe than World War II does. Over here, World War II does because like we participated in it, and we like to think that we came over there and beat the Nazis. But over there, World War I is just like it's still a really big deal because whole generations of people are just dead. And you sit there in the trenches and you think, why are we even fighting this war? Can anybody tell me why World War I was fought? And Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then what happened? Like, why was that a big deal?
It was this group.
It's Croatians, I think.
Everybody thought this group.
It kind of blew up because at this point in European politics, everybody had a treaty with everybody else, and so if you've got these kind of signed contracts, and if somebody goes to war against another group, then you're kind of vowed to go with them, and oh well, these people are attacking us, and guys got to come defend us, and so like everybody's got contracts with everybody else, and so everybody participates, and it's like it's totally political. Like there was no. It's like people that survive World War I, they have this huge sense of frustration because there's no point to this. It's just destruction, and so many people have died for politics. And so you've got these huge monuments to people just dead, piles and piles of dead. And Tolkien is influenced by this really greatly, the mechanization of war and industrialization of the means of death. Assembly lines for bombs and planes and things like this that are only meant to kill people. And so you've got this conception of evil as well. You see this in Saruman and in Sauron as well, but Saruman is kind of more emphasized in that, and that he wants, Treebeard says he's got a mind of metal and wheels, that he wants to mechanize and improve efficiency in order to dominate and to destroy. Which makes one think on the surface that evil is more powerful, because here it is, and it's got huge armies and big siege engines and all sorts of things. But as we see, the whole point of Lord of the Rings is that the smallest hands can turn the greatest wheels. And we will talk about that when we talk about hobbits. What is the nature of material reality? Well, at the beginning of the Silmarillion, there is a story called The Music of the Ainur, and that is just another word for the Valar. I'm not going to bore you with the technical details of their distinction. And the way that Tolkien kind of tells Genesis is that instead of God speaking, it's God singing, and he brings in all of the Valar and the Maiar, these angels in with him, and it's a big symphony that he directs. So it is ordered, but it has free improvisation and expression. Each of the Valar is able to sing and play to the best of their ability and to improvise on the main theme that God has laid out. And so this is how the history of the world unfolds, is as a pattern after this symphony. And that is actually really great and really beautiful little short story there. So go to the library and read the beginning of the Silmarillion. It's really great. What is a human being? I'm trying to get through this a little bit faster. So there are two main races in Tolkien called the Children of Eru. These are the ones that are like, this is what history is oriented around, and those are the elves and the humans. Dwarves are not actually part of this plan. They were actually made by one of the lesser gods because he wanted to make a people, and then God, Eru, kind of blessed them with life. So they're not actually part of the plan. I mean, they are, but they're not like, they have a lesser destiny, I think is the way to put that. Hobbits are classified as human beings. They're a type of human. So the elves came first, and they're the embodiment of artistry and of beauty and of higher culture. This is kind of the left-brained ideal is what the elves do. They're immortal. They do not die. They can be killed. And when they are killed, or when they kind of fade away, then they reincarnate and they kind of come back into the world. So they don't die, but they're also eternally bound to the world that they live in. Once the world ends, in the far future, that'll be it for the elves. So they're very, very linked to the natural world, as you can see from the movies. Hobbits, as I said, are a type of human, and they're kind of the stereotypical English country folk. As you remember, I said that Tolkien wanted to create a mythology for England. Well, obviously a mythology for England needs an English hero, and that is exactly what Frodo and Bilbo are. They're English country gentlemen. Sam is a gardener, and he is modeled off of another thing from World War I, which is that the officers, which would be the nobility or the upper class in England when they went to war, they had people called batmen, which carried their guns and reloaded and did things for them, and these were usually the lower class people. Now, normally in English society, these two classes of people would never have contact. Like that's your footman, and you're not friends with your footman, basically. But in the trenches in World War I, life and death, you realize, hey, this is actually a human being. And it kind of breaks through the class structure of English society. And that's what happens with Frodo and Sam, is that Sam is lower class, Frodo is upper class, but throughout this journey, they become just like inseparable friends. And that's echoing what happened in World War I with these upper class people and with their bad men. So the Hobbits emphasize the virtue of simplicity and the good earthly pleasures, and we're going to talk about that more in the meaning of human history. Man is what Tolkien calls it. It is politically incorrect, but that is his term. They are second-born. The elves kind of don't quite understand human beings because they are, they just die. It's really weird to the elves. They don't understand it. They're so brief on the earth. However, the elves know that humans actually are the ones with the greater destiny out of the two children of Iluvatar. They have free will, but they are the primary movers and shakers in the history of the world. And we will talk a little bit about human beings further on. So what happened, then you've got the Ents and the orcs and things like that. We're not going to really talk about them. We don't have time. They're minor in the big scheme of things. It's the elves and the human beings are the two that are what Tolkien really focuses on. So the elves are kind of the embodiment of everything that's good and noble about art and beauty and the creative impulse, and human beings are kind of modeled after these Anglo-Saxon or Norse myths of brave, hardy folk that overcome great odds. What happens to a person at death? For the elves, as I mentioned, they actually reincarnate. They can go across the sea to the undying lands, and they can kind of rest for a little while, and they can come back into the earth. If you read the book of The Lord of the Rings, there is an elf that has done this. He shows up. His name is Glorfindel, and he shows up when the party. Okay, so like where Arwen first comes in the movie, and like rides Frodo to Rivendell, she's not in the books. Like that's Glorfindel, and he is an elf that died thousands of years ago and has now come back. And so when Frodo is like in the Shadow World, after he's been stabbed by the Ringwraith, he sees Glorfindel as this bright presence. You can see that in the movie, that Arwen comes in and she's kind of glowing. This is Glorfindel, and he's glowing because he's been to heaven, basically, and come back. And like the light of divinity is still around him. But like I said, the elves only last as long as the universe. So there's also this great sadness to elven culture because they know it may last a really long time, but it's still not permanent. Like it's still going to pass away. Whereas human beings are paradoxically the opposite. Tolkien has Eru, God, give the gift of death to human beings. This is called the gift of man. And what happens is they don't understand it, but when humans die, they do not get reincarnated, but they go to this mysterious existence beyond life, which would be real heaven. We know that from living in the time that we do, but at that time they didn't understand what happened. And because of this gift of death, human beings are actually not bounded by time or earth. So the things that they do and the people that they become and the things that they accomplish actually will exist forever. And so you see Tolkien's emphasis on the importance of human culture and achievement, and that it is eternal. Why is it possible to know anything at all? Well, For this question, it is exactly the same as Catholic theology, which is that being created by God, God is the guarantor of a correspondence to reality. Because God is not a deceiver, we can trust that, when we pound on a table or when we see the sunrise, like that's actually there. We're not a brain in a jar or things like that. For the most part, it's actually there. There's a thing called the noetic effect of sin. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that before. That just means the effect of sin on your mind. And in original sin, theology holds that your mind is also corrupted, along with your ethics and other things like that. In Catholic theology, this is not emphasized very much at all. There's a big emphasis still on rationality and reason, and that the reason is still basically almost untainted. So for Tolkien, these effects of sin on your mind and how it's possible to know anything at all, it's not really applicable. Like the problem of sin corrupting your mental processes doesn't really come in. He's got a pretty low view of the fall, and that's a result of Catholicism again. To ethics, how do we know what's right and wrong? This is actually very interesting, because when I tried to answer this question when I was making the outline for this class, I kind of had to pause because he never really talks about it. And I don't really know what he would say about this. He says that it's a pre-Christian but monotheistic world. It's the same world, but they've got no gospel, they've got no written revelation, they've got no real communication from the deity. They just kind of do things, and they seem to know pretty evidently what is right and wrong. So it's their conscience, or it's a general revelation or something that to the characters in Tolkien's mythology, ethics are pretty seemingly self-evident. And the hard and fast rule for Tolkien is if you are desiring or trying to achieve power for its own sake, then it is evil. And if you are trying to save or preserve and use power for that, then you're generally doing good. So a lot of people criticize Tolkien for a fairly simplistic ethic. I think what they mean is that he believes that right and wrong are distinguishable, and that they are most of the time clearly visible. Tolkien does have a complex ethic. He talks a lot about virtues and different elements like wisdom and friendship and bravery and things like that. He's got a lot to say about these things. But the pessimistic kind of academy, they say, oh, well, if you believe in things like right and wrong, then pretty primitive. Think back to our discussion of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. This is the same group of people that Lewis is combating in that work. So it's just kind of like be brave and do good, and that's really all you've got to worry about for Tolkien. So what is the meaning of human history? We're going to stop and talk about this for a little while, because I think this is where Tolkien has a lot to say to us. I think this is where Middle-Earth really speaks and is relevant. The meaning of human history, we talk about what is the good life? What is the ideal human existence? Well, for Tolkien, it's the Hobbit existence. Like, I don't know, how many of you people, when you saw The Lord of the Rings, you say, man, I just really want to live in the Shire? Does anybody not think that? Okay, well, that's the point. The Shire is where everybody should want to live, because to Tolkien, like, this is ideal existence. It's simple, it's uncomplicated, it's pure, you've got your food, you just really enjoy a nice meal, you've got your drink. Tolkien loved beer, because he's English. Being short is the shortness for Tolkien functions as kind of like a metaphor for the fact that we don't see the significance in our own lives and actions. Like, we don't see the big picture. We just kind of do our thing and hope that it has significance. That's why the hobbits are small, because we ourselves are small in the big picture of the universe. But what he's talking about is that this hobbit, Frodo, he carries this little thing, and he changes the shape of the whole world, and that's what human beings can do, according to Tolkien. Hairy feet, I have no idea what he wanted with hairy feet. Yeah, I mean, you could shave them, I suppose. Friendship, you've got your comrades that you go to the pub with, and you guys hang out and talk late into the night. You've got your family. You've got the value of home. Everybody wants to live in Bag End. That place is awesome. You defend your homeland and peace. You don't have anything to fight against. You just kind of get to live your life and enjoy it. Conversely, when evil is present, it's bravery in the face of evil, and that you fight to protect what is good in your life because it's worth protecting. It's pure, and you kind of have an ethical responsibility to do something about it. So Tolkien was not a pacifist by any means. Even after World War I, he did believe in the value of war, but he believed in fighting to defend rather than fighting to conquer. That was one of the things that he really took away from this, is the domination, the sense of seeking to dominate that seems so prevalent in World War I, that all these people in the trenches, they're just thinking this is all, presidents and potentates and just trying to get more power and defend their position, and it's just like, he's got no time for that. So human history is the working out of the theme of Eru, and it's ultimately for his pleasure. The reason why Eru creates things is because he wants to, and it's he enjoys it. So everything is here for the pleasure of God and ultimately for his glory. If they're not, the question obviously arises, what happens if you're not doing things to the pleasure of God? Well, then you're not actually fulfilling the purpose of your existence. Finally, what I want to talk about in the meaning of human history is this term eucatastrophe. And I should probably write this on the board. This is important. You guys can throw this out in conversations in the dorm room and seem really intelligent. Obviously, I got the word catastrophe, which I hope everybody knows what that means. It doesn't always have to be bad. Tolkien, as a linguist, would be very conscious of the fact that a catastrophe can be positive. It just means a huge upheaval. And this prefix "u" is Greek for good. So it's a good catastrophe. And we can see this in the Lord of the Rings quite a lot, actually. He puts this in there. So, for example, at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields before Gondor, everything is coming apart, like Minas Tirith is about to fall, and the trolls are coming in, the city is burning, and all of a sudden you hear a trumpet. And you look up, and it's Theoden, Rohan is here. And then they've got that great charge, and they come in, and they turn the tide of the battle, right? You've got, obviously, the Battle of the Black Gate at the very end of the movie, the small stand, almost hopeless. They're about to be overwhelmed. And once again, you hear the eagles are coming, or at the end of The Hobbit, the eagles are coming. And the eagles come in and save them from the ring wraiths, and they give them time to fight so that Frodo can take the ring to Mordor. And finally, actually the destruction of the ring. All in a second, when everything seems lost, the ring gets destroyed, Sauron's tower falls, he vanishes, all the orcs fall into the earth, and all of a sudden everything's great. And so the reason why Tolkien put so many of these in his book is because that's how he believes the real world is constructed. You guys remember from the video that we watched, eucatastrophe appeals to us because it's in the nature of the universe. That's how God has designed things to function. It goes down, down, down. Sin is coming in all around us. Evil seems about to conquer. And then God comes in, he reminds us who's really in control, and he says, look, I'm going to save you. The greatest eucatastrophe is the crucifixion and the resurrection. Oh my gosh, how many, there was a great, Tim Keller did a sermon a few years ago, and he said, how many people lost faith at the foot of the cross, bearing eyewitness to the greatest thing that God has ever done for humanity? I just thought that was really good. It's like, you're looking at Jesus crucified, and you just think, how could it get any worse? How could it get any worse? But we know this has to happen. We know this is really going to turn out more amazing than we could ever have hoped for. And that's something that Tolkien really wants to emphasize. So he believes eucatastrophes happen all the time. It's kind of like the ripple in the pond. You drop a stone in the pond, and it ripples out everywhere. Tolkien and Lewis both share this idea. the idea of the true myth, the eucatastrophe, that because of the true myth of Christ incarnate, there are echoes throughout reality of this kind of one central fact of history. And so all the other myths of a God that dies and comes back, which there actually aren't any that are exactly like this. You hear that a lot. But either he doesn't actually die or he doesn't actually come back. Just for you guys' knowledge.
Can you explain anything about the people say about the similarities between the Christian story and Christian?
Yes, there aren't actually very many.
Yeah.
That they're stretching that quite a bit. There's a lot of good research on that topic if you just Google it. I mean, if you go to an apologetics website, there'll be a ton of links and resources to that. But that's a lot of times people have an agenda to do that kind of thing, and it's really like they're really stretching things quite a bit. But there are some similarities, and Tolkien would say that's no objection to Christianity. We should expect that to happen because this is the real myth. We should expect there to be echoes of this in every human culture around the world because this is the fundamental fact of reality. It's the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection. It's ripples in a pond. Okay, well, we've got a few more minutes. We can talk about C.S. Lewis's relationship with Tolkien. You guys want to talk about that? Okay. Well, they met at Oxford. They were both, well, Tolkien was a professor. He was much more respected at Oxford than Lewis was because Lewis wrote these kind of popular level children's books, and Tolkien had quite a bit more of a academic standing than Lewis did. Tolkien was a professor and Lewis was a don, which is kind of like not quite a teaching assistant, but like not a full professor, like a tutor basically. He's a private tutor. He had to go to Cambridge actually to get his professorship. And they met there, and they became really good friends. They bonded over Norse mythology, as I said. And Tolkien, hopefully you guys know this, Tolkien was one of the most influential figures in actually bringing C.S. Lewis to Christianity. And that's what the video is that I had you guys watch. He's not the only figure. There were other people that talked about it, but I think C.S. Lewis was just really puzzled by Tolkien because here you have this really brilliant guy, and he's got all your same interests. And he's not stupid. He's done his research. And he's got really good reasons for believing what he believes, and he's a Christian. And here you are, young, arrogant, atheist, mad at the world, and you just think, what's going on with this guy? I think that's an interesting point to consider. So, I think that's what everybody should ask about us. What's going on with this person? They stayed very good friends. They hung out with a larger group of people called the Inklings, and they met a lot of times at the Eagle and Child's Pub, which is actually a really awesome pub, and I've been there several times. I lived across the street from there for 6 weeks, which was one of my great achievements in life. And they have really good fish and chips. They hung out there, and they just kind of like did cool. I mean, if you've got a bunch of bros that are academics and they're professors at Oxford, like they talk about the things that you expect them to talk about. They read each other's stuff, and they make jokes and drink beer. And when Charles Williams was another author that came into Oxford later on, and he kind of stole Lewis away from Tolkien in a lot of ways, because Lewis really Charles Williams was his new best friend, and Tolkien's just kind of left in the lurch in a lot of sense. It's kind of sad. And they grow more distant over time because C.S. Lewis marries Joy Gresham, and she is a divorcee. Tolkien, being Catholic, thinks absolutely not. You can't get divorced, much less can you marry a divorced person. That's a sin to Tolkien, being Catholic. And to compound that, Lewis actually kept it secret from him. He did not tell him that they got married. So that was a big falling out that they had, and they didn't speak to each other very regularly for several years. Finally, once, they did kind of reconcile a little bit, more so after Joy died of cancer. They reconciled and they became friends again and started talking. And so they ended their friendship well. When C.S. Lewis died in 1963, they're pretty good buds again. There's a book called J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, A Friendship, and it's real quick. You can probably read it in a day or two. It's pretty cool. Talk about that if you guys want to know more about that. Does anybody have any questions? Is there anything else that you really wanted to know about Lord of the Rings? Because I can tell you, I know it.
Where did you get all that information?
I read a lot. I'm researching an article right now on the nature of evil in Tolkien and its relationship to song, and that there's songs all over the book. Every different type of creature in Tolkien sings, with two exceptions: the spiders and the ringwraiths. And I think that's important because these are the two creatures that are the most pure embodiments of evil in Tolkien. Sauron didn't used to be evil. Well, nothing. But these things are so far gone into evil that they are just, they're nothing anymore. They're just darkness. And so for Tolkien's song, I think, is a reflection of an attachment to reality and of liveliness. You've got life in yourself, and so you sing. Why? Well, because that's what the universe is based off of. This the song of Eru, the symphony. If you can't sing, then you're really far gone away from this design. So that's what the article's about. It's 20 pages already, and I'm halfway done. So I have no idea what I'm going to do with it, because that's too long for a journal article. So I'm just kind of writing it for no reason. But it's really fun. It's been really cool to research. All right, you guys. If you have any questions, then you can email Phil and or email me, because I'd love to talk about Lord of the Rings with any of you. Hopefully you guys have fun, and I don't know when I'm going to be back. If you guys have reading summaries, then you can stick these up at the front. I do not know Elvish. I knew I could read the alphabet 7 years ago for probably 2 weeks, and then I forgot it.